one of the questions that we get asked all the time is, can you really get well? Can you really overcome an addiction without God? And there are certainly, people who have a secular persuasion, who believe that you can overcome an addiction without God. The way I've always put it is this. I think you can stop an addiction practicing certain secular principles, but you can't heal from an addiction without God. Secular principles can take you so far, and the final journey of healing really begins with our relationship with God through His Son, Jesus Christ.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. Today we're going to continue a series that we began last week, which is the 7 Principles of Recovery. Today's installment is principle number 2, which deals with surrendering completely. If you'd like to find out the details of what Dr. Mark Laaser recommends about this topic, we think you'll enjoy this podcast. Here now is Dr. Mark Laaser and the Faithful and True podcast.
Today, Randy, we're going to pursue our series that we started our last broadcast, which was a description of the 7 principles that are involved in the healing journey out of sexual addiction. For that matter, they could be applied to a lot of problems and certainly any and all addictions.
These are universal principles that apply to recovery from, like you said, almost any form of addiction, right?
That's right. Now, how many people, though, have written about 7 principles of something or other? I mean, that sounds pretty popular. So, I don't want all of our audience to think that, we're just trying to, fashion this in terms of a number that seems to be popular. But there does seem to be 7 kind of universal principles. And the educated listener who has been involved in a 12-step program will certainly recognize that the 7 principles are not so much based on the 12 steps, but they are working off of the framework of the 12 steps and taking those 12 and coming up with 7 principles that we think are really valuable for all of us to be working with really on an ongoing basis. These are not principles that we work through one time. These are principles that we continue to work through really throughout the rest of our life.
And give the audience a quick recap of last week's principle number 1, if you will.
Last week, the principle was about powerlessness. It's about unmanageability. And the first principle of change is to recognize that there is a problem in our life over which we have little control. We've tried to stop and haven't been able to. We've perhaps at other points wanted to start something and haven't been able to be consistent with starting that. And as we talked last week, it's sometimes a recognition that there is an addiction process in place, and there's also a spiritual process in place in which the control issue is really vital in that we have to be willing to give up control of something in order to heal and in some ways get power back. In other words, we have to give up power in order to get control back.
So moving on to today, and you're going to tell us all about principle number 2.
Principle number 2 is stated this way: we believe in God, accept the grace offered through His Son, Jesus Christ, and surrender our lives and our wills to Him on a daily basis. So, Randy, let's just start with the end of that. What I've seen so often with the thousands of men that have come through our doors over the years is they've had moments, where they've been at church, they've been at some large gathering, some conference, some event. For some reason, I always think of Promise Keepers, which was really popular in the 90s. And they've had an experience. They've gone forward. They've had that, what I call that Billy Graham moment with every head bowed and eye closed, make your way to the front. And it is a transforming moment where they've had an encounter with Christ, and they've accepted Him into their life, and from that point on, they claim a personal relationship with God. And I think those moments cannot be underemphasized. I mean, that's an important moment.
Right. And
here's the ampersand again. And I do think that one of the mistakes that a lot of the men make is that they think that's a one-time thing, that now covers me for the rest of my life. And this principle is really about working a daily process of surrendering control.
It is a one day at a time process.
Yeah, and the audience will obviously recognize the fact that there's so many of the traditions that we use here, even in our ministry, that can trace their origins back to Alcoholics Anonymous, and one day at a time. The truth of it is that the 12 steps all along were really a spiritual journey, and AA was really one of the places that we learned that we needed to work those principles daily. We couldn't just do it once. We couldn't just march through the 12 steps, or in the case of what we're talking about, the 7 principles once. We have to really practice these principles in all of our lives on a daily basis. So we kind of start with the end of this principle, but just remind the listeners, if you've ever been frustrated that you've had that transforming experience, accepted Christ, thought you could walk out of the church that day, and then all of a sudden things would be magically different, this principle is for you, because it's a daily kind of practice that we need.
Well, and it also doesn't it encourage you to understand that there's no quick fix?
There's no quick fix, particularly when we're struggling with something that we're trying to change. I mean, change, whether we're trying to stop something or start something, involves a lot of practice and a lot of accountability and a lot of daily commitment to that change. And part of what happens to any of us who are trying to change something is that the initial enthusiasm, which is generally based on adrenaline, wears off. So part of the principle here is to emphasize that our daily walk with God needs to be a daily walk with God.
So as you're trying to find the solutions to your given addiction, then realizing that the answer does lie in surrendering our lives to God.
That's exactly it. And as I was thinking about the show this morning, people wonder sometimes how much I prepare for these things, and I could make a joke there, but I do spend a lot of kind of mental and spiritual energy thinking about the show, and I really think that one of the questions that we get asked all the time is, can you really get well? Can you really overcome an addiction without God? And there are certainly, people who have a secular persuasion, who believe that you can overcome an addiction without God. The way I've always put it is this: I think you can stop an addiction practicing certain secular principles, but you can't heal from an addiction without God. Secular principles can take you so far, and the final journey of healing really begins with our relationship with God through His Son, Jesus Christ.
Well, in essence, what you're doing is reinforcing the principles that Faithful and True operates on. Mm-hmm. What really makes us unique from other treatment centers around the country is that combination of clinical and spiritual approach to your healing.
That's right. So I just want to be clear about this one. I mean, I don't want to offend all of those brothers and sisters that we have out there who are using words like higher power or coming up with their own brand of spirituality. We are certainly the farthest thing that I can think of from judgmental, in terms of those people. We are not Bible bashers. We are not fire and brimstone, you're going to hell types here. We are wanting to look at this proactively, And my own life is a testimony to the fact that without God and His help and the intervention in my life of the Holy Spirit and the grace that is offered to all of us through the substitutionary death of His Son, Jesus Christ, I mean, without that, there's really not a lot of hope as we move forward. Now, even in this principle, I think part of the work that we have to do, by the way, and let's get into thinking about some of the stuff we need to think about surrendering the control of our life. As some of the audience know, I've always been a kind of an historian of the recovery movement, and the truth of it is, in the original statement of the 12 steps, the word God and so forth was used more directly. And what happened was there were so many of the early followers in Alcoholics Anonymous that came to Bill W. and Dr. Bob and described, really kind of egregious situations and how they had been abused at church, how they had been judged by other Christians, how their drinking problems were considered, moral issues, and that they were just the worst possible people. So they had grown up in some black and white thinking, really harsh, really judgmental places. And the very mention to some of those people of God was really difficult because God had been used to more or less beat them up. So, even in talking about Principle 2, I just want to acknowledge that, there are a lot of people out there, and the church, with a capital C, whatever local version of that you've been involved with, has not always been, a safe place.
Which leads to an awful lot of reluctance.
That's right.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And that's the first hurdle we're going to have to get over here in working this principle, and that is maybe encountering some of the spiritual disappointment or perhaps even spiritual abuse you've experienced in your past. Mm-hmm. In the history of the movement, there have been a lot of people who, for lack of a better phrase, have been beat up in the church. They have not felt safe in churches. They have gotten what I consider to be a point spiritually abusive advice. They have been labeled things. They have been ostracized. They have been just told, this is a will problem, and just think about this more. And what I'm trying to reach out to the audience about at the moment is that there are a lot of people who are listening that might have the experience of pastors and church people, elders, leaders, not always being kind, not always being understanding, not always being welcoming. And so therefore we have some trauma really about even going to church. Maybe growing up, our parents just dragged us to church and never really explained to us why. Maybe our dad was an elder in the church, or in my case, the pastor of the church, but when we were home, there were abusive things that were happening. Dad is an elder of the church, but Monday to Friday is drinking every night and beating up mom, or that's an extreme example, but there's a lot of our audience that probably experienced some religious hypocrisy growing up, and so they haven't really seen the vitality of a true and honest relationship with Christ. And I just want to accept the fact and tell all of our audience that we completely understand if you've had negative experiences. We just encourage you to keep talking about that. At some point, the spiritual journey of the second principle is simply about a willingness to explore spirituality. It's sometimes a willingness to be willing. It's an openness to the fact that there's got to be something more out there in the universe, and that God is actually in control, although, in some of our historical experience, He may not always seem to be in control. Now, another element of that, and we've talked about it actually in Principle 1 last week, but I think a lot of our men that come to us have been disappointed with God because, they have some magical thinking about God. They think that God is the God that if they just know how to pray well enough, if they just figure out the right formula and ask God to heal them, change them, do whatever, that God will do that. And the volume of disappointment and even anger at God that I have seen over the years is very large. And
well, does that lead an individual to examine their personal view of God?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it. In fact, one of the the things that I was going to talk about this morning is, I don't need to get into all of this academically, but years and years and years ago, there was a study that was done at the University of Chicago in which the pastors and psychiatrists involved figured out that they had equal power to diagnose patients about mental illness. And the psychiatrists asked their standard questions about depression or whatever. The pastors asked questions about view of God. And at the end of the interviews that both the pastors and the psychiatrists did, the pastors, who had been trained in mental health diagnosis, by the way, were able to give a fairly accurate diagnosis. In fact, the psychiatrists and the pastors agreed about 98% of the time. And here are some of the questions the pastors ask. When you think of God, does he ever smile? If you ever picture God, does he have a warm, inviting, or smiling look upon his face? When you think of Scripture, what is your favorite verse? When you think of the Bible, who is your favorite Bible character? When you think of religious music, what is your favorite hymn or piece of religious music? And from the answers to those questions, we can sometimes discern that a person really doesn't have a very positive, view of God. God always frowns. God hates me. God, is a punishing, punitive God. God is an angry God. The characters that show up are the desperate types in the Old or New Testament. I'd ask the listeners, if they really want to engage with this program, to think about, over the years of their life, growing up in church or church school, a Sunday school, whatever it is, what is their view of God, and who are some of their favorite characters in the Bible, and what are some of their favorite scriptures? They may not be able to quote chapter and verse, but just even thinking about these questions can be the beginning of a spiritual journey or quest.
And if an individual has a negative view of God, how does that individual go about healing his view of God?
Well, I do think that it's very important for a person to go through and be able to talk with other people, their accountability group, their sponsors, perhaps, pastors or priests that they trust, to go through some of their religious history. I really do think that here at Faithful and True, it's very important for us when we consider the history of a person to get a sense of their entire history in the church, a history of their relationships with people in their life, like parents or others who called themselves religious. So it's very important for a person to be able to talk about what their life experience has been. If there is stories of disappointment, abuse, anger, it's very important to talk about those things. And then I think, part of my journey in the early days was to be around people that I considered religious or spiritual people that seemed to be experiencing more the peace of a relationship with Christ, not some, hard-fisted, black and white thinking, slap yourself in the face kind of people, but people that I consider to be graceful. I cannot emphasize enough that I think it's really important for people to be around graceful or grace-filled people. People of understanding, people of wisdom, people who are much farther down the road. And that is really the essence of what the principles are about. Not working these principles alone, by the way, but working them in fellowship with others.
Does that work its way back into some of our earlier conversations shows ago about the need and importance of having an accountability group?
Yeah, that's right.
It feels to me, as you explained that just now, that to surround yourself with people that are God-filled people, that if you have an accountability group, your chances of interacting with individuals like that are much greater.
That's right. And, in the early days of maybe just, a part of my own story would be helpful here to the audience to help them know, where to look here and where to start. The truth of it is that in my first year of recovery, I did not go to church. I had been raised in the church. My father was a pastor. At that point, I was ordained. And, the Sunday before I went into treatment, I had been preaching at a church. So, I had religion inside and out. I was, like I said, ordained and very familiar with the practice of ministry. And, when I got into the treatment program, I think one of the benefits of the treatment program at that point, almost being secular at that point, was that there were no expectations of religiosity. And if I had heavy-duty expectations of religiosity preached at me in the treatment program, I might have rebelled against that. So what was important to me is that, in a way, I could put some of that away and not even go to church. And that led to the fact that, the 12-step groups that I was going to at that time, in every case, met at a church, but the church would usually give them, the room in the farthest corner, in the dingiest, darkest place in the basement. And it actually led me to accept a saying that I had heard in AA, which is, oftentimes the church basement is a more graceful spiritual place than the church sanctuary. Mm-hmm. And so eventually, on my own time, in my own way, in my own beliefs, I was able to really be working on Principle 2 and come back to God, come back to Christ on my own terms. And I think that was not my own terms in terms of controlling it, but in terms of finally understanding what it was all about.
Well, it sounds like you reached a place where you could finally place your hope in God.
That's right. And part of what stimulated me into that story was the fact that, yes, I was in accountability groups where there were people of mature spirituality, people that were really modeling their relationship with Christ. They were, in fact, Jesus with skin on, as we say. They were graceful. They were forgiving. They were understanding. They were tough, at times in a healthy way. They reminded me of truth and, all kinds of things. There were so many people in my early recovery journey who modeled to me so much more effectively what a Christian program is all about. And that allowed me to come back to the church in a healthy way. I think another way to put it, maybe more simply, is that I had the church really shoved down my throat growing up, mm-hmm. and I had to come back to God
on your own terms.
On my own. Yeah, that's kind of misleading. On my own terms. I mean, we're talking today about surrender. Mm-hmm. But it had to be my surrender, not a surrender that had been kind of forced upon me by others, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
Hopefully the audience can kind of relate to this conversation we're having. And the word conversation, I think, is one of the keys here today, which is that I remember talking to one of my favorite people who happens to be a nun, and I was kind of investigating, all the various formal prayers that, Catholics are prone to say, the rosary and so forth. And so I was trying to understand the rosary at the time, I remember. And even as an evangelical Protestant, and basically one of the things that this nun said to me is that whether we're doing the rosary or whatever kind of prayer we're doing, we're having a conversation with God. And there's so many times throughout a given day when, I don't necessarily sit, bow my head, close my eyes, and say some formal prayer. But there is so many times throughout the day when I have a conversation with God. Mm-hmm. That sense in the Bible, it's so accurately described, even Jesus on the cross calling God Abba, that God is a father, God is dad, God is, a safe person that we can talk to. He doesn't always answer our questions the way we like. He doesn't always do the things that we so angrily demand. But he is a God that is willing to have a personal relationship with all of us, and that he is accessible for us to talk to.
Thank you for joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. We hope that this podcast has been beneficial to you. We will be continuing this series of the 7 Principles of Recovery in the weeks to come. But for now, we wanted to jumpstart it for you, and we hope it's been beneficial to you. We'd like to, if you haven't already, we'd like to invite you to visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many available resources to you. We also want you to visit our information about our 3-day intensives. We host the Men's Journey Workshop every month, and then 3 times a year we have the Women's Journey Workshop, and then we had 2 formats of the Couples Journey Workshops. Check out all the information and registration possibilities on our website. Visit faithfulandtrue.com for more information. In the meantime, we hope this coming week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.